Just 7 minutes ago, the palace issued a declaration that no royal observer ever expected to see. Camilla's position as Queen Consort has been revoked with immediate effect, and Princess and has been formally appointed to take her place beside the king. There was no gradual transition, no ceremonial farewell, and no opportunity for private discussion. One announcement completely changed the royal hierarchy, and behind its carefully chosen wording stood a family already beginning to fracture. Before we dive deeper into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla read the declaration twice. Her fingers tightened around the page, and when her secretary entered, she asked why no one had warned her. The sealed statement carried King Charles's signature, the royal seal, and an exact activation time. The royal seal is the official mark proving an order carries the monarch's authority, meaning this was not a rumor, a temporary punishment, or a decision open to appeal. And received the same document at St. James's Palace and remained standing while reading it. She placed it on the table before telling her aide she had never asked to take another woman's place. Even so, the Princess Royal understood the enormous weight behind it. Queen Consort is the title given to the wife of a reigning king. But this extraordinary arrangement transferred the responsibilities beside the monarch to his sister without ending the marriage itself. One sentence struck harder than all the others. The change, it declared, was necessary to protect the continuity, discipline, and credibility of the crown during a period of internal instability. That wording mattered because the crown represents more than the individual wearing it. It refers to the monarchy as an institution whose authority depends upon public confidence. Camilla heard humiliation without warning, and heard responsibility. Charles heard the price of a betrayal he believed he could no longer overlook. The king sat alone after approving the release, staring at the pen he had used while repeated knocks on the door went unanswered. He had signed the order before dawn, long before his wife became aware of it, proving the decision had been prepared entirely in silence. Across the palace, William cancelled 2 meetings and demanded a private briefing. The Prince of Wales understood the public statement revealed only the surface of a much deeper crisis. Then came the line no one could explain. A second sealed document existed, but the palace refused to publish it, and would not publicly accept the position until she learned exactly what Camilla had done and why her brother had waited until that very morning to act. But the announcement could not be understood through titles alone, because behind those titles stood 3 people connected by marriage, blood, loyalty, and a wound none of them could hide. The palace statement reduced the crisis to a simple change in royal responsibility, yet no official language could contain the personal devastation beneath it. Camilla had spent years fighting for acceptance beside Charles, and had built her reputation through service without ever seeking a crown. And the king now stood between the wife he had defended for decades and the sister whose loyalty had never required defending. For each of them, the announcement carried a different kind of loss. Camilla felt that loss before anyone dared explain it. She had survived years of public criticism, cold palace corridors, and whispered doubts over whether she truly belonged beside the monarch. The role of Queen Consort, the position held by the reigning king's spouse, carrying ceremonial responsibilities but no independent sovereign authority, had become proof that the institution had finally accepted her. Now that proof disappeared in a single morning, and felt no triumph. She had earned respect through decades of demanding engagements, military associations, and unwavering public service carried out without asking for affection in return. That was why palace officials believed she could assume immediate ceremonial responsibilities without creating further disorder. Yet during a private meeting, the Princess Royal told William that duty could never erase the cruelty of replacing someone within her own family. He heard frustration in her voice, not ambition. Charles remembered something even more painful. Years earlier, he had privately promised his wife that she would never again face public judgment alone. Now his own signature had broken that promise. The king held an old photograph of himself and his sister as children when William entered the study, and the image revealed what his silence refused to say. Trust between them had existed long before Camilla became part of royal life. Camilla removed the diamond brooch prepared for that evening and placed it carefully inside its case. She told her aide the palace had not simply changed her schedule. It had erased her future. Her words were preserved in the aide's written account, recording the moment long after the room had fallen silent. William pressed his father for the truth. The monarch explained and had been selected because she commanded respect throughout the family, the armed forces, and palace staff. But he still refused to explain why everything had happened so suddenly. Then the private memorandum emerged. A memorandum is an internal written record used to explain official decisions and responsibilities. It revealed that Camilla had attempted to expand the consort's office by placing several royal functions under advisors personally loyal to her, and refused to wear any consort insignia, the badges and symbols representing the position, until she heard Camilla's explanation face to face. William finally disclosed that the crisis had begun during one specific ceremony 3 weeks earlier, when the Queen Consort issued an instruction that directly contradicted the king. And when William named that ceremony, Charles finally looked up, because everyone in the room knew it had been the moment from which there was no turning back. 3 weeks before the palace announcement, the royal family gathered for what was supposed to be a carefully managed ceremony of unity. Instead, a single instruction delivered inside a guarded corridor created a division that could no longer remain hidden. Camilla believed she was protecting the future of her office, and believed the authority of the crown had been challenged. Charles tried to contain the disagreement privately, but by the end of that evening, a formal written warning was already being prepared, and noticed the change only minutes before the royal service of continuity began at Windsor Castle. The ceremony required senior members of the royal family to sign a symbolic pledge outlining their responsibilities during the king's reign, making the order far more significant than simple protocol. She lifted the revised seating card, examined it without speaking, then asked the waiting official who had authorized her name to be moved. Camilla answered before anyone else had the chance. She guided the Princess Royal into the adjoining corridor and insisted that the monarchy could not function while the king's wife remained beneath his sister in the official order of precedence. That order of precedence is the formal ranking determining where members of the royal family stand, sit, and appear during official duties. The Queen Consort argued that her office required visible authority if palace staff were expected to respect its instructions, and never raised her voice. She told Camilla that precedence was not a reward for personal acceptance, but a discipline designed to protect the structure of the crown. The monarch's sister warned that altering it without written approval crossed a dangerous boundary because it allowed one household to speak as though it carried sovereign authority. Charles arrived just as the confrontation ended. He opened the ceremonial folder, discovered the replacement page, and immediately tore it out. The king ordered the original arrangement restored before anyone entered the chamber. When his wife accused him of publicly undermining her, he replied that she had weakened herself by issuing a command in his name without permission. But the damage had already spread. That evening, the keeper of the privy records submitted a breach memorandum, an internal report documenting conduct that may have violated royal procedure, and recommended an immediate review of the consort's authority. William later learned through that written record that Windsor had not been an isolated incident. 3 earlier instructions had redirected staff appointments, patronage announcements, and access privileges toward Camilla's private office, and still urged her brother not to publicly humiliate his wife. She believed the family could survive a private correction. But Charles discovered the altered ceremonial document had already reached several senior officials. Silence was no longer protection. It had become permission. The monarch summoned Camilla for one final confrontation. His sister waited nearby while an unsigned removal order rested on the desk between loyalty and consequence. By the time Camilla entered that room, the argument was no longer about a seating card. It had become a question of whether the crown still answered to the sovereign's voice. There were no cameras, no private secretaries, and no carefully rehearsed smiles when Camilla entered the king's study. Charles stood behind his desk with the Windsor Memorandum open before him, and remained near the fireplace, not as a rival, but as the witness Camilla least wanted to face. For several long seconds, silence filled the room. Then Charles slid the altered ceremony page across the desk and asked his wife one question. "Did you authorize this?" Camilla admitted she had. She explained that palace officials continued treating her office as merely ceremonial when it was supposed to support the reign itself. The Windsor Precedence document, the official paper establishing the order in which senior royals appear and carry out their duties, had become, in her eyes, proof that nothing had truly changed. She insisted she acted only to protect the authority expected of the king's wife, and stepped forward before Charles could respond. She told the Queen Consort that genuine respect could never be created simply by moving names on a page. The Princess Royal said Camilla had knowingly used the monarch's authority without approval, warning that such power could never be borrowed through marriage. Camilla turned toward and she accused her of building a quiet alliance with William, one designed to influence Charles whenever he became emotionally uncertain. The accusation struck the room like lightning. The king slammed his hand against the desk once, startling both women into silence. He declared that neither his wife nor his sister would speak, as though he had already lost control of the crown. Charles opened another folder. Inside were 3 additional directives carrying Camilla's approval marks, including a proposal to replace senior household officials with advisors selected by her private secretary. The royal household is the staff structure responsible for official duties, schedules, communications, and palace administration. Those appointments mattered because controlling them meant controlling which voices reached the sovereign first. Camilla insisted every proposed change had been intended to protect him from exhaustion. The king quietly asked why every form of protection she proposed also increased her own influence, and stepped toward the door, prepared to leave the couple alone. But her brother instructed her to remain. The decision, he said, now concerned the institution, not simply the marriage. Camilla finally broke. She asked whether decades of loyalty could truly be erased because of one ceremony and several instructions. Charles replied that the number was never the issue. What mattered was the moment affection became permission to act in the sovereign's name. The king slowly turned the unsigned order toward her. She saw his name beneath the words immediate assumption of consort duties and quietly pushed her chair back. Before Charles could sign, William arrived carrying a file that proved the struggle had already spread into preparations for the next reign. The marriage had reached its breaking point. But William's file would transform a private breach of trust into a crisis threatening the future of the monarchy itself. William entered carrying no dramatic announcement, only a thin dark folder sealed by the office of the Prince of Wales. Charles recognized its importance immediately. The documents inside concerned the transition to the next reign, plans that were never supposed to be altered without the heir's approval. Camilla watched William place the folder beside the removal order, and for the first time that morning, her anger gave way to fear. Someone had gone much further than anyone had realized. William carefully opened the file. As heir to the throne, he held responsibility for planning the future royal household, including the staff, duties, residences, and official structure that would support his reign. He could not remove the king's consort while Charles remained sovereign, but he could prevent unauthorized plans from shaping what came after. That made his cooperation essential. Without it, the current crisis could damage the succession itself. Camilla stared as he revealed a draft transition framework. The document outlined how authority would pass from one reign to the next. Yet several clauses had been altered. Her advisors had attempted to secure permanent positions and continued influence after Charles's reign came to an end. One section would have allowed the former consort's private office to retain influence over royal residences, charitable foundations, and selected archives during William's future reign. Camilla denied approving those changes. She demanded her former private secretary be summoned immediately. The determination in her voice revealed something deeply unsettling. Even she might not have known how far her staff had pushed the plan. William remained composed, but the pain beneath his words was impossible to ignore. He told her the framework treated his future household like territory being divided before he had even inherited responsibility for it, and examined the signatures and recognized one court advisor she had previously warned Charles about. A court advisor is a senior official who helps guide royal decisions and communications, and this individual had quietly built competing channels of influence for months. The Princess Royal reminded her brother that divided authority always begins quietly, through access, appointments, and documents that seem insignificant until it's too late. Charles read the final page, closed his eyes, and removed his spectacles. The king admitted that protecting Camilla from criticism had prevented him from seeing what had grown around her. William then asked the one question no husband ever wants to hear. Was he making this decision under pressure? Or was he acting as sovereign and accepting full responsibility? The monarch picked up the pen and signed. He told, and her appointment was not a reward, but an emergency duty intended to restore confidence. She placed her hand over the order and insisted on written limits to her own authority before accepting it. The ink had barely dried when a knock echoed at the door, carrying the first visible sign that Camilla's royal life had already begun to disappear. Royal power rarely disappears through raised voices. It fades through revised schedules, collected keys, removed names, and doors that no longer open. Before Camilla left the king's study, her chief equerry was informed that all of her official engagements had been suspended. The consort's red dispatch boxes were recalled. Her security designation was revised. Then an aide entered carrying a velvet tray and politely requested the insignia representing her household authority. Camilla looked toward Charles, but he could not meet her eyes. She tightened her grip around the access card when another official asked for it. The card granted entry to the consort's offices, private briefings, and restricted palace rooms, making it far more than an ordinary pass. She quietly reminded Charles that he had personally given it to her on the morning of the coronation. The king answered softly that it represented an office, not their marriage. She returned it before telling him the palace had made those two things impossible to separate. The transition moved swiftly, and received temporary authority over ceremonial coordination, household representation, and consort responsibilities while staff followed a strict protocol to update stationery, seating plans, briefing access, and engagement approvals before the evening bulletin. A protocol is a formal set of procedures officials follow during sensitive royal transitions. Every amended page mattered because even minor confusion could suggest the monarchy no longer controlled its own affairs. And entered the consort's office and found Camilla's unfinished speech still resting on the desk. The Princess Royal carefully folded it and instructed staff to deliver it privately instead of throwing it away. She understood that taking over a position did not give her the right to erase the woman who had held it before. William gave staff the same instruction. The prince ordered everyone to treat Camilla with dignity, warning that humiliation would transform an institutional correction into personal cruelty. Even so, the machinery continued. A senior courtier removed her nameplate from the briefing room while she walked at the far end of the corridor, and the sound of metal striking the table reached her before anyone could conceal it. Camilla's closest aides were suspended pending investigation, including the advisor connected to the transition framework. Within minutes, the network that had once surrounded her vanished. Charles allowed his wife to keep her private residence and personal style, meaning the form of address she could still use socially, proving he intended to remove authority without destroying their private relationship. Camilla refused to leave through the private exit. Instead, she walked through the main corridor with her head held high as palace staff silently stepped aside, and received the first dispatch box but left it unopened. She refused to begin her duties until she had spoken privately with her predecessor, without Charles, William, lawyers, or courtiers present. Only hours after the palace divided their positions, and crossed the corridor alone to discover whether anything personal could survive what the crown had done, and entered without aids, folders, or ceremonial insignia. Camilla sat beside an untouched cup of tea, still dressed for an engagement she would never attend. For the first time, neither woman had an official nearby to soften what needed to be said, and quietly closed the door and remained standing. Camilla asked whether she had come to inspect what remained, and replied that the crown had spoken, but the family had not. She explained that she had never wanted the role of Queen Consort, and would carry it only for as long as stability required. The position meant supporting the reigning monarch through ceremonial and public responsibilities, but she refused to treat it as a personal prize. She told Camilla that no secretary would record their conversation, no lawyer would shape their words, and Charles would not enter to rescue either of them from the truth. Camilla admitted she had authorized the Windsor change. She confessed she feared becoming powerless as the king's health, energy, and public confidence faced increasing pressure. After spending years being judged as an outsider, every limitation placed upon her office felt like proof that the family still expected her to disappear. The Queen Consort admitted that fear had followed her into every room, even after the crown appeared to offer acceptance, and listened carefully, but she did not surrender her position. She said fear might explain the decision, but it could never excuse it. Using Charles's name to overrule the structure he had sworn to protect crossed a boundary that love could never erase. When Camilla asked whether and believed her love for Charles had ever been genuine, the Princess Royal answered that love had never been the issue. The danger began when love became a reason to justify control, and gently placed the unfinished speech on the table. She had refused to let palace staff destroy it because losing authority should never mean losing dignity. Camilla's anger slowly faded. She admitted advisors had convinced her William intended to isolate her completely during the next reign, leading her to approve protections without carefully examining every clause, and promised the review would separate Camilla's own decisions from the ambitions of the officials surrounding her. But she refused to promise restoration. The former consort removed the brooch from her dress and offered it across the table, and quietly declined. She said the symbol belonged to the crown and had to be surrendered through proper procedure, not passed between two wounded members of the same family. Camilla then asked her to protect Charles from the loneliness his decision would create, and answered that she would protect the monarch. But Camilla alone would have to decide whether she could still protect the man. Inside that room, Two women had finally spoken with complete honesty. Outside, their private pain was becoming the most public royal rupture of an entire generation. By late afternoon, the announcement was no longer confined to palace corridors. Broadcasters interrupted their regular programming. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Newspapers redesigned their front pages within minutes. Some viewed Anne's appointment as the return of duty. Others regarded Camilla's removal as a harsh public rejection after years of service. Yet one image captured the nation's mood more powerfully than any commentator ever could. Two women stood outside the palace gates holding signs supporting opposite sides, yet silently standing beside one another. Rain fell steadily as hundreds gathered beneath umbrellas, listening while one broadcaster read the declaration aloud from a mobile phone. The palace insisted the decision represented continuity, meaning the work of the crown would continue without interruption despite the crisis. Yet replacing a living Queen Consort had no modern precedent, ensuring the story spread across the world within minutes. One newspaper rebuilt its front page in black and gold beneath the headline, "The King Chooses Duty." Anne's formal portrait dominated the cover, while a smaller photograph showed Camilla leaving the palace. A national broadcaster described it as the moment family loyalty collided with sovereign responsibility. Those words immediately divided public opinion between sympathy and judgment. Camilla watched alone until one commentator described her removal as inevitable. She switched off the television before the sentence was finished. Hearing strangers reduce decades of struggle, acceptance, and service to a single conclusion hurt her more deeply than the official order itself. Anne arrived at Clarence House to meet Charles before their first appearance together. The residence serves as one of the King's official London homes, but that afternoon it felt less like a royal residence and more like a place of reckoning. She noticed his hands trembling while fastening his cufflinks and quietly reminded him that courage never makes a difficult decision painless. The monarch replied that pain could never become an excuse for delay. William released a brief written statement supporting his father's authority while thanking Camilla for her years of service. The prince understood the delicate balance required, protecting the institution without publicly destroying the woman who had stood beside it. Public criticism softened further after officials confirmed she would retain her private residence, personal dignity, and family protection. Then the suspended advisor accepted responsibility through a documented statement for drafting the most aggressive transition clauses. The admission showed Camilla had approved the plans carelessly, but weakened accusations that she had personally orchestrated the entire scheme, and insisted that clear limits on her new authority be published before carrying out her first official duty. That decision reassured those who feared unchecked power had simply changed hands. By the following morning, she would stand beside Charles during a national service. Camilla would also be present privately, outside the formal procession, but not beyond its consequences. The world had already chosen its headlines. But the monarchy's true verdict would arrive the following morning through three people who could no longer hide behind ceremony. The following morning, Charles entered the national service with and beside him, not as a triumphant replacement, but as the sister carrying a responsibility he could no longer bear alone. Camilla did not attend. She watched privately as the congregation rose. And when Anne paused before taking her place, the meaning of the crisis became unmistakable. This was not one woman's victory over another. It was a public reckoning with power, trust, love, and duty. And wore no newly assigned jewels and instructed officials to keep every announcement focused on the king. Her new role as Queen Consort, the position supporting the reigning monarch through ceremonial and public responsibilities, came with authority, but she refused to present it as a personal triumph. Charles hesitated at the entrance, and quietly offered her arm, reminding everyone that she stood there to support her brother, not to replace his authority. Camilla watched from her private residence with the unfinished speech resting beside her. The grief remained deep and painful, yet beneath it a quiet sense of relief had begun to emerge. The palace had ended the struggle before power completely consumed the marriage. For the first time, she realized that losing the office might be the only way to preserve what still remained between them. After the service, Charles visited her without aids. He left his royal briefing folder outside the room, showing that he entered not as the sovereign who had dismissed her, but as a husband. Camilla accepted responsibility for approving decisions she had not fully examined. She admitted that fear of exclusion had driven her toward powers the consort was never intended to possess. Charles refused to claim innocence. He confessed that his reluctance to challenge her sooner had allowed resentment and ambitious advisors to grow unchecked. The king understood the removal order judged his delay just as much as it judged her actions. Love had made him protective. But protection without accountability had slowly become permission, and formally accepted the position under clearly defined written limits. She could not alter succession planning, household authority, precedents, or royal appointments without the sovereign's approval. William endorsed those restrictions through an official statement, declaring that her service would be guided by transparency and restraint rather than private influence. The investigation removed the most ambitious advisers, cleared junior staff who had merely followed instructions, and cancelled every clause intended to shape William's future reign. Camilla remained part of Charles's private life but surrendered every formal consort responsibility. Her dignity remained intact, even though her authority did not, and accepted the role without celebration. Camilla endured the consequences without being destroyed. Charles preserved the monarchy but lost the comforting belief that affection and duty could always exist together without conflict. Each of them surrendered something: power, resentment, certainty, or pride. And that sacrifice became the price of survival. And so the palace announcement entered history not as Anne's triumph or Camilla's downfall, but as the morning the crown chose responsibility over comfort, and endured because no one was allowed to stand above it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.